Well, based on current modeling, it looks like the coronavirus situation in Ontario is, out of control. The day after Christmas, Ontario was placed on a full lockdown to try and control the out of control pandemic rates. The virus has been spreading effectively uncurtailed for several months now. After the first wave back in the spring, things calmed down over the summer. Mostly we had a nominal level of infection, but as fall started to approach, especially after school came back in session, cases just started to explode. And of course, with the Christmas season approaching, these cases went even worse as people started to visit and bring the virus with them to their friends and family. So as of Boxing Day, we started a lockdown, and as of tomorrow, well, I guess we're in more lockdown. Lockdown 2. Lockdownier. The main difference that I can discern is just how frowny-faced the Premier is when he's describing the measures, but I guess there are a couple of practical limitations. The hours of operation for retail stores have been decreased, and also there's now limits for outdoor public gatherings down to 5, and also that masks are now recommended for people who are in outdoor areas where distancing is somewhat difficult. So really not all that much has changed from the first phase of the lockdown, and frankly, I'm not really all that confident that much difference will be made. Now, Doug Ford has publicly stated that he's not laying any blame here, but I am. Frankly, he's somewhat to blame, as is his government, as is the policy of the government that is currently in power, the Conservative Party of Ontario. They rolled back at the beginning of the term paid sick leave as a requirement for employment. This was introduced by the previous government, the Liberal government, to establish a norm for paid sick leave for workers. I have to go pay attention to this cat now. I would argue that paid sick leave would be one of the main tools to combat a pandemic. If people are feeling sick and they're able to stay home from work without the consequence of, well, poverty, I think they would be less likely to spread the virus to their coworkers and any members of the public that they may encounter as well. But this doesn't seem to be important to the Premier as well as the Conservative Party. They've not made any indication that they're going to reintroduce this policy, and in fact publicly they've stated that they're not intending to. To the federal government's credit, they did institute the CERB, the an emergency fund basically to pay people who were rendered out of work when everything had to shut down in the first phase. That's now been phased out into a special form of employment insurance, but there is there's a bureaucratic barrier to gaining this benefit. And as well, it doesn't really benefit the people that already didn't have a job or people who were struggling to work in a gig economy or something like that. There have already been some letters sent out to people who apparently were ineligible for the CERB benefit that got it anyway because there was no checking at that time, being ordered now to repay all the funds that they had gained, even though many of those folks really ought to have received it in the first place. The trouble is here, there's an economic incentive to bad behavior. And when you end up with an economic incentive to bad behavior, you get bad behavior. Whereas what we needed to control this pandemic was for everybody to just stay home. If we did that for a couple of weeks or a month, this would all be under control at the moment. But unfortunately, we've allowed it to grow to the extent where we're in emergency measures here. Many of the ICUs in the province are overrun. We really won't be able to keep up if things continue the way that they are, and there's no real indication that they're going to stop being growing at this rate. The most effective thing would have been a full lockdown and paying people simply to stay home. Just give everybody $2,000-$3,000 and tell them, stay home for the next month. You don't have to go to work unless your work is legitimately essential. No frivolous outings, nothing like that. And suddenly virus rates will go down. The other trouble, though, is that it would require the participation of the people of Ontario to actually work. One of the reasons for the more stringent lockdown and the frownier face of our premier is that people haven't really been following the rules. They've been continuing to go out, continuing to see people that they ought not to be seeing in unsafe situations, continuing not to wear masks where they ought to be wearing masks, just a whole bunch of dangerous behavior. And, well, I would also lay the blame for this situation on them as well. There's an argument to be made here about infringement upon our rights. And yes, I mean, this is an infringement. We're being compelled to do something that we probably don't really want to do. I personally, I would love to go to a party right now. I would love to go outside and be able to see people and not wear a mask. That would be just lovely. But as an anarchist, I follow the rules. Now you might be thinking to yourself, did he just say that as an anarchist, you should follow the rules? But yeah, that's exactly what I said. The thing about anarchy is that it's not just chaos, it's not lawlessness, it's not just doing whatever you want to do. There's a great deal of responsibility that comes with being an anarchist and living in an anarchist society. Anarchy is about the rejection of unjust law, unjust power relations. And when it comes to justice, this has to take into account the feelings and the needs of all the people of society, not just yourself. Simply rejecting rules because you don't want to follow them without considering the needs of the many, that's not anarchy, that's selfishness. The best way to understand this is the difference between positive freedom and negative freedom. The difference between freedom from versus freedom to. In the usual sense, freedom to is the ability to choose whatever you want to do, the ability to do whatever you want to do. I can walk outside my door, I can go anywhere I want to, I can talk to anybody I want to, I can believe and do and say whatever I want to say. On the other hand, negative freedom, freedom from, is your ability not to be impinged upon by undue law or by the actions of others impairing your ability to choose, to have freedom. Now this is where the responsibility aspect comes in, because as someone who is freely choosing, it is also your responsibility not to impinge upon the freedom of others. As a true fan of liberty, as an anarchist, one ought to have a responsibility to one another and a responsibility to society at large to be able to ensure not just your own freedom to do whatever you want, but also the freedom of all other people to have that same level of freedom. Now, of course, you would have to moderate this and mediate this, because no one person can have total, absolute freedom without impinging upon the rights of others. And similarly, you wouldn't want someone else to have absolute freedom and impinge upon yours. So there has to be this balancing act. And this is why we do have laws. It's a restriction on your freedoms in order to prevent you from impinging on others. As an anarchist, though, one is very concerned about the justice of these laws, whereas some laws may be purely punitive in nature. Take, for example, the war on drugs. The war on drugs represents an infringement of personal choice, of liberty to. It's the freedom to alter your consciousness in whatever way you choose. As a consequence to this, people are locked in cages. This is an unjust law. No one is being hurt, nobody's freedom is being impaired by someone choosing to alter their consciousness, with a few exceptions perhaps, but yet people are being thrown in jail simply for exercising something that ought to be a human right. Pandemic restrictions, on the other hand, not so much so. I may want to have the option to not wear a mask and go out in public and see a whole bunch of people and breathe heavily on them, but my doing so poses a risk to them. I don't know whether or not I have the virus. I wouldn't know if I'm developing symptoms of the virus for several more days. I could be contagious right now at any moment and not know that I'm actually infected until days later. This is why it's so important to be proactive in our measures. So of course this involves wearing a mask. The mask keeps the virus particles close to you, prevents you from breathing them on other people. It also provides you a little bit of protection from them breathing it onto you. Keeping distance also prevents your virus particles from getting too close to anyone else. And of course the most important thing is just stay the fuck home. Just don't leave your house if you don't have to. And if you are leaving the house, stick to yourself. I go for walks nightly. I walk around the block, walk around the neighborhood, and I'm several meters from any other person that may end up getting infected. I'll admit, without hopefully incriminating myself, that I haven't followed the letter of the law always. I live by myself, and I am very low risk. I have very few circumstances where I'm actually in close contact with people. I don't really work outside my home. I don't really have any sort of social contact beyond my own sphere. So I've seen a few people sparingly. I have a friend that I go for walks with, and we do try to keep our distance, but of course there is a small chance that we might pass the virus from one to another. But the person I go to walks with also is mutually isolated with not many other people. So even though I'm not perfect in the measures that I do, I'm at least doing what I can do in a reasonable way to prevent me from being a vector of transmission. To me, the letter of the law isn't nearly as important as the spirit of the law. If the intention of the law is to keep people safe by limiting the spread of the virus, even if people aren't perfect in what they do, as long as they're following the spirit of the law and doing what they can to protect other people, that qualifies. I have a diverse group of people on my Facebook list and in my extended acquaintance circle, and some of them are pretty pissed off about these measures. They won't follow them. They're refusing to follow them, either because they don't believe the virus is real, which requires some pretty impressive mental pretzeling at this point, or they simply don't care. They don't have the compassion necessary to take the necessary measures because they're more concerned about their own personal freedom too. They're not following this idea of freedom from. The anarchists in my world, however, they're all 100% on board. They're trying their damnedest to follow the rules as they're designated in the spirit of the law, not necessarily always the letter of the law, but doing as much as they possibly can to protect their fellow persons from getting this virus. Even as an anarchist, sometimes I oscillate as to whether or not a stateless society is possible or even desirable. And in this case, I see the state as an instrumental aspect of how we're controlling this pandemic. It would require most of the citizens of our civilization to be on board with this notion of freedom from in order to act in a way necessary to protect people. And as such, some state coercion, to a certain degree, is necessary to be able to get everybody on board. But where the line is drawn is when that coercion becomes unreasonable, or if the coercion and the reason for the coercion is unnecessary or unwarranted. The fines that are being handed out for people that are holding parties, yeah, absolutely. That should be, that is being very effective in terms of discouraging people from having incredibly dangerous experiences. On the other hand, if people were being thrown in jail, thrown in solitary confinement, or executed for doing something like that, well, that's disproportional. It doesn't really even have any more effect than it would have if it was a fine. If there were no state, there would be no body to administer these fines and enforce these laws. So how would we deal with it in that case? Well, for such a fundamentally different kind of society, it would require a different kind of people. It would require the universal consent or near universal consent of the people that are involved in such a society. They would want to do the things necessary to protect one another without even a law being enforced. Unfortunately, we don't really live in a world like that. Both the citizenry and the state are increasingly reliant on authoritarian measures to get things done and enforce these laws. The same may be true about climate change, whereas the economic forces towards continuing to pollute and destroy ecological systems in order to get more money continues to be an economic incentive to bad behavior. The only tool that we have right now is to enforce regulations, to enforce laws. If, however, we lived in a different kind of world where our corporate citizens, our human citizens, and our economic model were such that the actions of the free market were ecologically sound, ecologically beneficial, then we wouldn't need these laws. So if you're on the fence on these things, you should be following the rules. It's pretty unambiguous at this point that we need to do something. Do absolutely everything possible to protect your fellow human beings, and hopefully we'll get out this alive on the other end. Anyway, I do this daily, so if you enjoy my content, feel free to subscribe and like and share it with your friends and, all that YouTube stuff. And, I'll see you tomorrow.